Hello YouTube. So today I want to stir up some more drama with a new and improved tier list video. Like my previous video, I'm only going to do 5-star characters for this tier list because I don't really believe in lumping 4-star and 5-star characters together like this. It would also just be way too much work to include 4-star characters as well. Also, this time I have a specific grading criteria I will be using to determine what tier each character goes in. So I have 7 different categories that each character will be graded on from a scale of 1 to 10. Category 1 is their DPS and supporting capabilities, so how good their DPS is, or if their support, how good their support is. If they are a mix of DPS and support, both will be considered. Category 2, how good they are in single target. Category 3, how good they are in AoE. Category 4, how good they are in multi-wave. Category 5, how good their vertical scaling is. Category 6, shield check, so basically how good they are at dealing with different enemy shields. Category 7, accessibility and flexibility, so this will include things like how reliant they are on having a 5-star weapon over accessible 4-star weapon options, how flexible their team options are, so how well you can flex out different members of their team and still get similar performance. How mechanically easy they are to use, so do they have really difficult combos, or are their combos really simple to execute, and other things like that. There's more things that will be considered here, but it'll take forever for me to list every single thing. And they'll be graded on their overall score combined from all 7 of these categories. If their score is 61 to 70, they'll go into S tier. A tier will be 51 to 60, B tier 41 to 50, C tier 31 to 40, and D tier 30 or anything below 30. Also, I want to mention that I will be factoring in how good the unit's teams are in these categories, not just the unit themselves. But if the unit is only good in this category entirely because of their team, then that'll be taken into account and not just give them a super high score just because their team is good at it, but the unit itself doesn't contribute to it at all. Lots of little things like that will be taken into account. And also, I want to make it clear that if a unit, just because a unit places higher on this list, then you would think. So what I'm trying to say is, if one unit places higher than another unit on this list, that doesn't necessarily mean that unit's generally going to be better than the unit that placed below them, because they might have placed higher because they got a high score in a category that's not necessarily always relevant. So just keep things like that in mind when looking at this list. Also, with this video, I am speaking without a script for this video, so you're probably gonna hear me stuttering, speaking over myself, misspeaking, things like that quite often. I'm not used to speaking without having an outlined script to read from, so just have some patience with me regarding that. But yeah, let's jump right into this. I don't have these units listed in any particular order, so just gonna go with the way I have them listed, which is in no particular order. But first we have Wanderer. Where is he? So for DPS supporting, Wanderer gets a 10. His DPS output is very, very good. Easily some of the highest, if not the highest, in the entire game. Single target, I gave him a 9. Although his single target output is extremely good, he does have one caveat to it, which is that against high HP bosses, you might not be able to rotate them, and if you don't, then you're gonna have to go through rotating through all of your supports again before you can go back to him and finish it off, which can take off probably like 6 to 7 seconds off of your clear, just having to rotate through everyone again before you can continue his DPS window, since his DPS window isn't really long enough to, like, you can't really like extend his field time to finish something off that's like really close to being finished off, if you know what I mean. So that's just one little caveat that's preventing him single target from being a 10. It's not super relevant, so it only takes off for 1 point though. Then AoE, he gets a 10. His AoE is excellent, and he can easily run a group war like Kasawa or Venti to take even further advantage of it. Also, his range gives him a huge benefit in AoE because he doesn't have to spend any time chasing after spaced out enemies. Multi-wave, he gets a 10. Similar reason as AoE. His range makes him excellent for multi-wave. You don't have to spend any time chasing after the enemies. Vertical scaling, he gets a 10. He has easily some of, if not the best constellations in the entire game. His constellations are absolutely insane. Shield check, he gets a 6. He can deal with shields pretty well because he's a Nemo if you're an AoE. But in single target, a Nemo isn't that effective against any shields. You can flex around the last slot of his team to deal with whatever specific shields you have to deal with though, so he only loses 4 points on this. And then accessibility / flexibility, he gets a 5. We do have to take off quite a lot of points for this because he's very reliant on having C6 Pharaohs on, which drastically reduces his accessibility. But aside from that, there's not really anything holding him back here. He's extremely easy to use. You pretty much just spam normal attacks or into C, which is extremely easy to do. He can be reliant on his shield depending on what you're facing and how good you are at using him, but he has so many really good shield options that that's not really a big deal. So yeah, I think 5 is a reasonable score for him. And overall, that gives him a score of 60, which places him right into A tier. Wait, I have this typed wrong. Okay, 51 to 50, it's 51 to 60. Alright, next we have Haytham. So for DPS supporting, Haytham gets a 10, single target is a 10. AoE is an 8. I took off 2 points just because although his AoE is pretty good, a lot of his team's damage typically comes from Hyper Bloom, which is single target. He also can have a bit of an issue trying to run a group board to take advantage of his AoE, so couldn't give him full score here. Multi-Wave is also an 8. He doesn't have any huge issues in Multi-Wave other than Nahida and also having to run after chase after enemies that are spaced out, but none of those are really a huge deal with him, so it only takes off 2 points. Vertical scaling is an 8. His constellations aren't that good, but you can get his signature weapon and also Nahida constellations, Yaylon constellations, Kasawa constellations if you're using him, stuff like that. Allows him to have really good vertical scaling for his teams, even if his own constellations aren't necessarily that good. Shield check is a 7. Had to take off some points here because cryo shields really hurt Dendro teams. You can use Bennett to help with cryo shields, but that requires you using Bennett, which might have result in you having to use a less powerful team than you would want to use. And then accessibility, flexibility, he gets a 10. He's extremely easy to use, and his teams are very flexible. Wait, no, I misspoke. He's not extremely easy to use. His combos can be pretty difficult, but he's still extremely powerful, even if you don't do his proper combos. And he is very flexible. His teams are extremely flexible, so I think he deserves a 10 here. And then so that gives him an overall score of 61, which places him into S tier. Next, we have Zara. So for DPS / supporting, Zara gets a 10. His output is absolutely incredible. Single target is a 10. Although Zhao is known as an AoE DPS, in my opinion, he's actually more of a single target DPS than AoE. This because in single target, his output is absolutely incredible because the extra collision punch damage you're getting makes a single target DPS really freaking good. AoE, I gave him a 9. I didn't give him a 10 here because although his AoE is really good, he pushes enemies away, which can prevent him from actually hitting everything. And then multi-wave, I gave him a 6. Just because for his output to really be where you want it to be, you really want to be using Bennett with him. And you have to use Bennett along with Zara pushing enemies away, so you're likely going to have to move out of Bennett's circle in multi-wave, which is going to lower your DPS by a lot, so I had to take some points down here. Vertical scaling, I gave him a 6. His constellations, except for C1 and C6, are pretty bad. But you can still do C1 R1 for pretty decent vertical scaling, and you can get really good damage output out of him by just improving his artifacts the best you can, so that kind of counts towards vertical scaling, so I think a 6 is fair. Then shield check, he gets a 7. So his plunges still with Geo shields, and then you can sort of flex around his slots depending on the exact shield you're facing. So, but can be a bit of an issue, so 3 points need to be deducted here. And then accessibility, flexibility, gave him a 3. This is because his combos, like his jet combo in 1 CJP, can be very difficult to execute. He is reliant on having C6 Farazan and Bennett and a Childe, which makes it really hard to flex anything around in his team. And also, there was something else here. What was it? I can't quite put my tongue on the other thing I had here for why he only gets a 3, but you get the idea. He's not super accessible or flexible, so overall that gives him a score of 51, which puts him into 8 tier. Next up, we have Nahida, DPS not supporting, she gets a 10. Single target is a 10. AoE is a 10. Multi-wave is a 6. Have to take off some points here because she marks enemies, so the next wave of enemies isn't going to have the mark. This isn't too big of a deal if you're using a team that can just quickly swap back to her. But some of her teams can't do that, so we still have to take points off for that. Vertical scaling is a 10. Her C1 and C2 are absolutely amazing. Her C2 basically just makes any team that uses her automatically have great vertical scaling. Then shield check, she gets a 7. Again, cryo shield's really hard to danger teams, so we have to take some points off for those. Then accessibility, flexibility, she gets a 10. Pretty self-explanatory. Overall, that gives her a 63, which puts her into S tier. Where is she? Next is Baizu. So DPS not supporting, he gets a 10. Supporting is absolutely incredible. Single target is a 10. AoE is a 7. I had to deduct some points here because his burst applies single target dendro. However, he's still pretty good in AoE because although his burst is single target, you're not going to be hitting the same target every time, so you can still apply dendro onto multiple targets. Plus his skill does jump between up to 3 enemies, so you can still apply multi-target dendro. It's not actually that bad. Multi-wave, he gets a 10. Basically solves the multi-wave problems that Nahida has. Vertical scaling is a 7. His own constellations aren't that great, but again, he's Dendro, so this team's automatically have good vertical scaling. Shield check is a 7. Again, cryo shields bring down Dendro teams there. Then accessibility and flexibility is going to be a 10. So overall, gets a score of 61, which puts him into S tier. Next, we have Ridein. So DPS slash supporting, she gets a 10. Single target is a 9. AoE is an 8. I have to deduct some points here because it can be difficult to keep enemies grouped to really take advantage of her AoE. And also, some of her teams like Ridein National and Hyperbloom are much more single target than AoE, so she does have great AoE, but can't really give her full points for it. Multi-wave, she gets a 6. So her DPS teams and multi-wave, you're more than likely going to have to leave Bennett's circle. And also the next wave of enemies isn't going to have the VV shred from your Anemo unit. So can't give her full points here. Vertical scaling is a 10. Her constellations are really good up to C3. Her weapon is also a good vertical investment. You can also invest in things like Yai constellations, Kasawa constellations, and stuff like that to scale her even farther beyond C3 R1. Shield check, I gave her an 8. Then accessibility, flexibility, I gave her a 10. So her overall score, I give her a 61. Also, I want to mention real quick, it's going to take me forever to try to fully explain the exact reason for the score I give each unit in each category. If I try to do that, this video is going to go on for forever, so I'm going through some of these points briefly because if I think they're like pretty self-explanatory. So if you have any questions about any particular point that I didn't expand much on, you can just ask in the comments and I'll be happy to conversate with you on that. But yeah, Raiden score is a 61, which puts her into S. By the way, this tier list is actually in order. My previous one wasn't, so if units have the same score, like Haytham, Baizu, and Ridein all have 61. I'll kind of like use my personal judgment to decide where exactly I place them. So, yeah, I think that makes sense. Next, I have Zangoli. So, DPS slash supporting, I gave him a 10. Supporting is very good. Single target is a 10. AoE, I gave him a 9. Multi-wave is a 7, just because in multi-wave, enemies are likely going to spawn out of the range of his pillar. Vertical scaling, I gave him a 5. His own constellations are pretty terrible, except maybe his C2, because it'll let you use his burst and skip his skill. His teams can still have good vertical scaling, but it's not because of him at all, so I didn't really want to give him much bonus points for that, since it's not actually because of him. Shield check, I gave him a 5. He gives teams a great option for dealing with Geo shields, but his presence on the team automatically means you have one less slot to deal with any other shields other than Geo, so couldn't give him many points here. Then accessibility, flexibility, he gets a 10, so overall he gets a 56, which puts him into A tier. Where is Zangoli? There he is. Alright, next I have Yaylon. So DPS supporting is a 10, single target is a 10, AoE is a 5. She doesn't really have AoE, and a lot of her teams like Hyperbloom, Hutao, Yoimiya, etc. are also pretty bad in AoE, so can't give her anything above a 5 for AoE. Multi-wave, she gets a 9. There's nothing in particular holding her back in multi-wave, but there's also nothing particularly exceptional to give her a 10, so I think 9 makes sense. Vertical scaling is a 10. She has probably overall the best constellations in the entire game if we go all the way up to C6. And her presence on the team just automatically gives them good vertical scaling for early constellations, elegy, and stuff like that. Shield check, she gets an 8. And then accessibility, flexibility, she gets a 10. So overall, that gives her a 62, putting her into S tier. Next, Hutao. So DPS supporting, she gets a 10. Her DPS is really, really good. Single target is a 10. AoE is going to be a 4 though. Her AoE is really, really bad. I know she can get AoE on her charged attacks, but it's not reliable. Enemies don't just line themselves up like bowling pins for you to do that. And also when at AoE, enemies are likely going to be spaced out. I mean, you're going to have to spend extra stamina on Hutao just to get to them, which having to spend any extra stamina on Hutao at all is really bad. But she does have some AoE, so she gets, I gave her a 4 here. I think that was pretty reasonable score. Multi-wave, she gets a 6, because as I just mentioned, in multi-wave, enemies are more than likely going to be spaced out. Like, you can have one wave of enemies on one side of the abyss, and the next spawns on the other side, and you're going to have to spend time going up to them, and in addition to extra stamina to going up to them, so that holds her back in multi-wave. So I gave her a 6 for that. Then vertical is a 10. Her own constellations beyond C1 aren't very good, but we also have excellent ways you can invest in addition to that, like Yaylon constellations, Elegy, getting Jade Cutter on Xingqiu, getting Kasawa to C2 and Freedom Sun, and stuff like that, all for really good vertical scaling, so I think a 10 is reasonable there. Then shield check, I gave her a 5. Hutao is actually pretty bad at breaking shields herself, even cryo shields. I find that she's pretty bad against them, especially since cryo makes you move slower and can mess with your stamina even further. And yeah, you have 2 Hydro units, so Hydro shields are really going to be a problem. You also have to use Zangoli if you want to deal with Geo shields, but I mean, that's not really a big deal since Zangoli is one of our best teammates anyway. Then accessibility, flexibility is a 5. She's mechanically very difficult to use, and her teams aren't very flexible since you really want to be using double Hydro. The last slot can be decently flexible, but there's not that many units you can really use for it, but you can flex it out between those options like jungling Toma, jungling Kazuha, Sucrose, etc. So there is a decent degree of flexibility to her first slot, but overall she's not very flexible, so I think a 5 is reasonable. Overall, that gives her a score of 50, which places her into B tier. Next is Yoimiya. So DPS I supporting, I gave her a 9. Her DPS is really good, but it's not quite on the level of the units that I gave a 10. Single target is a 9. AoE is a 3. Only reason it's not lower than a 3 is because she has the benefit of it being arranged, so you're not really likely to have to spend much time chasing after enemies that are spaced out in AoE. That's like her one saving grace in AoE. Multi-wave is an 8 for the same reason. You don't have to spend much time chasing after a wave of enemies that spawns halfway across the abyss since she's ranged. Although her range isn't good enough to like completely nullify the issue like it is for Wanderer, so we still have to take off a couple of points for it. Vertical scaling is a 6. Our constellations aren't that good, but you can at least crouch onto Yaylon constellations and Elegy, so I think a 6 makes sense. By the way, if I ever have any like awkward pauses between speaking, I'm probably taking a drink of water because I'm speaking for a very long time without much pause here, so I need a lot of water. Shield check is a 7. She's pretty good against most different types of shields. Cryo, Electro, Zangoli, and Yunjin can deal with Geo. Hydro is the main issue, which is actually a pretty big issue. So 3 points deducted for that. Then accessibility, flexibility is a 7. She's extremely easy to use, but her team isn't very flexible. So you have you need Yaylon for Hydro. You can use Xingqiu, but you're gonna lose a lot of DPS because you lose Yaylon's buff or damage, and your rotation is gonna be a lot longer. So you can use Xingqiu, but you don't really want to. Then her main buffer slot you want to be Bennett or Yunjin, not any much you can do other than use one of them. Then the fourth slot pretty much has to be a shield, so the only good shield options are Toma and Zangoli, so not much in the array of flexibility with the Armia, so overall she gets a score of 49, which puts her into B tier. Next, I have Klee. So DPS supporting is a 9. Her DPS is really, really good, but again, just not quite on the level of the units I gave a 10. Single target is a 9. AoE is a 9. Multi-wave I gave a 6 because she's pretty reliant on being in Bennett's circle to do good damage, but her range isn't good enough to like be able to stay inside Bennett's circle when a new wave of enemies spawns, so there's that. Vertical scaling is an 8. Her constellations, especially her C2, are really, really good, but aside from her own constellations, I don't really know how else you can vertically scale her team, so can't really give her full points there. Shield check is a 7. Main issue is going to be Pyro shields, since she likes to use a mono Pyro. You could use a Vaporized team, but in my opinion, Vaporized Klee is pretty shit, so we still take off 3 points for that. And accessibility, flexibility is going to be a 2, the lowest score we've seen for this so far. Klee is extremely mechanically difficult to use properly. And also, she's a child model catalyst, which means she has extremely low poise, so if you're not using her with a shielder, you're going to be getting knocked around a lot. Her team is also not that flexible because you kind of really want to be using mono Pyro, so yeah. Overall, she gets a 50, putting her right to B tier. If I can find her, there she is. Alright, next is the Luke. DPS as supporting is a 9, same reason as Klee and Yoimiya. Good, just not quite on the level of a 10. Single target is an 8, AoE he gets a 9. I feel like that's something people really underestimate with the Luke, because he has pretty good AoE, something that, it's like Yoimiya and Hu Tao while lacking in, he really excels in. Multi-wave is a 6, just because Bennett Circle, no range, so yeah. Vertical scaling is a 7. His constellations are decent, they're not great. I'd say they're like average or slightly above or below average. But you can also do things like getting Kaya constellations, Yaylon constellations, and Elegy if you're going Vape instead of Melt. Kasawa C2, Freedom Sorn, stuff like that. But he is also a standard banner unit, so I feel like I have to take that into account since you can't really plan to get his constellations. And then Shield Check is a 10. First 10 we've seen for this. He's excellent against basically any shield type. He's a Claymore, so he breaks Geo shields. Pyro, so he breaks Cryo and Electro very fast. For Hydro, you can use Melt and deal with those very easily. So yeah, he has an answer to everything. Accessibility, I gave him a 4. This is because his 4-star weapon options aren't that good. If you're using Vaporize, you can use Rain Slasher, which is alright. But if you're using Melt, your best option is likely going to be Melt Flower, which people who start playing after that event aren't going to have, so that has to be taken into account. Then also you really want to have things like Kaya Constellations, Bennett C6, and other things like that with him. So that really brings him down with the accessibility side of things, so I think a 4 makes sense. But overall, that gives him a score of 53, which puts him into A tier. Next is Ayato. DPS less supporting, I gave him an 8. I don't think he's quite on the level of the characters that I gave a 9 in terms of DPS. For supporting, his supporting is really just providing AoE Hydro for more DPS, so can't really give him extra points for the supporting side of things. Single target, I gave a 6. This is because all his teams can still be really good in single target because Hyper Bloom. They're not good in single target because of him. They're just good in single target because Hyper Bloom. And for Hyper Bloom, for single target specifically, you'd rather be using Xingqiu or Yaylon, so can't really give him above a 6 for single target. AoE, I give him an 8. He is really good in AoE, but again, you're likely using a Hyper Bloom team if you're using Ayato, which has some fall off in damage in AoE, but with Ayato it's kind of made up for because of his AoE, so I think an 8 makes sense. Multi-wave is a 7. Not too many issues in multi-wave. Nahida can be an issue, but not too big of an issue since Ayato's field time is super low. But also nothing in particular making him really good for multi-wave, so I think a 7 makes sense. Vertical scaling is a 7. His constellations are decent. I personally don't think any of them are very good except for C6 though. But then you also can do things like Nahida C2, so I think at least a 7 makes sense. Shield check, I gave a 6. Again, cryo shields. And with Ayato, I feel like you have less room to really deal with cryo shields properly. Then accessibility, flexibility, I gave him a 10. He's pretty accessible to use, and his teams are very flexible, so yeah, I think 10 makes sense. But overall score is 52, so that puts him into A tier. Where is he? There he is. Now, Childe, DPS supporting is 10, pretty obvious. Single target and AoE are both a 10. Multi-wave I gave a 6, because again, Bennett Circle, you're likely going to have to leave it in multi-wave. You're also going to lose the VV Shred from Kasawa, and enemies might even spawn out away from Kazua's burst, so you might lose Kazua's buff there too. Vertical scaling, I gave an 8. His constellations are pretty awful, but you can do things like getting Polar Star on him, Scarlet or Engulfing Lightning on Zangoli, and getting Kasawa to C2, but aside from that, there's not really anything else you can do, so I think an 8 is fair. Shield check is a 7. Main issue is going to be Hydro Shields, which are a pretty huge issue, so I had to take off 3 points there. And accessibility, flexibility is a 3. There's not really any room for flexibility here. I suppose you could try and use Sucrose instead of Kasawa. I don't know how well that's going to play out, though. And then, but yeah, there's no other room for flexibility there. And his team is also extremely hard to use properly, so we have to take off quite a lot of points for accessibility, flexibility. Overall, he gets a 54, which puts him into A tier. If I can find him. It's so hard to find the units. There he is. Next, Kasawa. Supporting is a 10. Single target, I gave a 7, just because you lose the subtle quadratic swirls in single target. And also his grouping doesn't have any value on single target. But AoE is a 10. Multi-wave is a 7, just because maintaining his buffs in multi-wave can be an issue. Vertical scaling, I have a 9 here, but I'm actually going to change that to a 10, because C2 and, C2 and Freedom Sword can be very powerful for a lot of teams. Shield check is a 9. Kazuha is actually really, really good at dealing with shields because of absorbing his burst and his A4, as well as swirls and AoE. So, yeah, I think a 9 makes sense for him there. Then accessibility, flexibility is 10. He's an extremely flexible unit and very accessible to use, so Overall, I gives him a 63, putting him in S. This is the only Kasawa I see, so I'm just gonna go with it. Next, Nilo. DPS supporting is a 10, her teams have incredible DPS. Single target is a 4, she has pretty big fall off in single target. I've seen people claim it's not actually that big of a deal, but I don't believe them. AoE is a 10 for obvious reasons. Multi-wave is a 9. Her teams do use Nahida, but it's not that big of a deal since her teams are quick swap. You can just quickly swap back to Nahida. But it does need to be taken into account to some degree, and also you still have to run towards enemies and lose some DPS if they spawn halfway across the abyss. But with Nilo, I don't think that's that too big of a deal, so we only took off 1 point. Vertical scaling is a 10. Shield check is a 6 because cryo shields just completely destroy her. Then accessibility, flexibility is a 7. She does have decent flexibility within the range of units she can use, but that is still restricted to only Hydro and Dendro, so I think a 7 makes sense. Overall, I gives her a 56, putting her into A tier if I can find her. What was Zangoli's score again? Let me check. I don't remember what Zangoli was. Zangoli was a 56, so they're about tied. I think Nilo right below Zangoli makes sense. Next is Sino. DPS supporting is 10. His damage output is absolutely incredible. Single target is a 10. AoE is a 6. This is because a lot of his team's damage comes from Hyper Bloom, which is single target. But also his own damage itself can be fairly single target, but his attacks actually have pretty decent AoE. It's just depending on the way enemies are spaced out, you'll have to be careful with how you place Sino in order for him to hit all of them. And then he also has his Chaos team, which has a really good front-loaded AoE damage, so I think actually a 7 would make sense for AoE, but I have it at 6. I'm just going to keep it at a 6. I probably had a good reason why I put it at 6. I don't remember specifically, but I'll keep it at 6, but I think you could argue a 7 and that's pretty reasonable. Multi-wave is a 7 because Nahida. Baizu has really helped fix the multi-wave issue, and also his Chaos team too, but multi-wave is still an issue even in those teams. It's just significantly less of an issue than it was before we had Baizu or before we discovered Chaos, so I think 7 makes sense. Vertical scaling is a 10. His vertical scaling is just absolutely incredible. There's basically no shortage of ways you can vertically invest into Sino. Shield check is an 8. Dendro teams usually get messed up by cryo shields, but Sino is actually pretty good at dealing with them because he applies Electro extremely fast, which can help deal with the cryo shields in a reasonable amount of time. The accessibility, flexibility is going to be a 7. He's pretty simple to use, even with Thundering Fury. I know people like to say his Thundering Fury combos are hard to use, but I mean, it's pretty unga bunga. You're just spamming his normal attacks and then pressing skill as soon as it comes off cooldown, so yeah, I give him a 7 here. Overall, he gets a 58, putting him into A tier. Right below Wanderer. Next is Ito. DPS as supporting, I gave him a 9. Single target an 8. AoE is a 10 though. He has very good AoE without even needing grouping. Multi-wave is an 8. Main reason points are taken off here is because you're going to be enemies are going to be out of reach for Zangoli's pillars, and also probably out of reach for Albedo's skill if it's even still alive. Vertical scaling is an 8. He has pretty good constellations. Shield check is a 7. You can flex around his 4th slot to deal with specific shields, but you're using 3 Geo units, so it's not going to be particularly great at any shields other than Geo. The accessibility, flexibility is a 5. This is mainly because if you don't have his weapon, Redhorn or Serpent Spine, your best bet is going to be something like Black Cliff or White Blind, which are significantly behind Redhorn and Serpent Spine, so he is quite heavily reliant on having his weapon or spine. But also his team isn't super flexible, so you need to have 3 Geo units. The 4th slot is flexible, but aside from that, there's no flexibility, so I think a 5 makes sense. Overall, it gives him a 55, putting him into A tier. Next, Eula. So DPS is supporting, I gave her a 7. I feel like she's just like 1 point below the units that I gave an 8. Single target is a 7. AoE is a 6. Multi-wave a 6. Vertical scaling a 9. She has pretty good constellations. Shield check a 6. Accessibility, flexibility an 8. So overall, that gives her I should speak on its flexibility a bit. Our teams are actually pretty flexible. There's actually quite a lot of different units you can use to good effect with Eula, like Rosaria, Micah, Bennett, Diona, Ridein, Faisho, Shanha. There's actually a pretty solid amount of flexibility in Eula's teams. But overall, she gets a 49, putting her into B tier. Next, we have Yai. DPS / supporting is a 10. Single target is an 8. AoE is a 9. Multi-wave is a 9. One of the great things about Yai is that she kind of helps fix multi-wave issues for a lot of the teams that she's in, so I think a 9 makes sense here. Vertical scaling is a 10. She has excellent constellations, and her weapon is also pretty good. Shield check is a 6, just because, again, cryo shields in Dendro teams. Then accessibility, flexibility is an 8. She has quite a lot of teams she can go into, and she's not super reliant on having her weapons. You can just use Widsith since she's a Catalyst user, and she makes use of the EM, so the RNG with Widsith isn't even bad on her. But overall, she gets a 60, putting her into A tier. If I can find... There she is. Next, Ayaka. DPS as supporting is a 10. Her output is very, very high. Single target is an 8. She loses points here because bosses can't be frozen, which is the most common single target scenario. So you lose 20% crit rate there, and also single target bosses might move out of the reach of her burst and make you lose damage. AoE is a 10. Multi-wave, I gave her a 5 because a new wave of enemies is likely not getting hit by her burst, which means you're basically doing hardly any damage on that second wave of enemies until you can start your second rotation. Vertical scaling is a 10. She has really good constellations and also Shanha constellations. Shield check is a 4 because she's just completely walled by cryo shields. Basically nothing you can do about it. Other than, like, I guess you could try to run a Melt Ayaka team, but I don't think that's very good. Accessibility, flexibility is a 3. She's one of the least accessible 5-star units in my opinion because of how many different 5-stars you need for her team. You need her, you need Kasawa, you need Shanha, you need Kokomi. You can use a Mona if you don't need to shield her, but Mona is a standard banner of 5-star, so she's hard to get if you don't have her already. Then you really want to have Mist Splitter as well, so you really kind of need to have a 5 gold team with Ayaka. So, yeah, I think a 3 makes sense. Then overall, that gives her a score of 50, putting her into B tier, tied with Klee and Hu Tao. I think I'd put her above Klee and Hu Tao. Next, Shanha. DPS has supporting, she gets a 10. Her supporting is excellent. Single target, I gave her a 9. AoE, I gave her a 7. This is because in AoE, her quills get used up a lot faster. But her teams are still really good in AoE despite that, so I only took off 3 points for it. Multi-wave is a 6, basically same reason Ayaka lost points for multi-wave. Vertical scaling is a 10. Her constellations are pretty good, and also the constellations of the characters you use her with, like Ayaka or Alganyu, are pretty good. Shield check, she gets a 4, because again, cryo shields. In accessibility, flexibility, she gets a 4, just because she's only useful in cryo teams. So that gives her a score of 50, so I'm gonna put her... I think I'll put her right behind Hu Tao. Next, Dia. DPS as supporting is a 2. She's not good at DPS or supporting. Single target is a 2. AoE is a 2. Multi-wave is a 4. You lose a lot of points here because, again, being reliant on Bennett's circle. And also because, let's say you finish off a wave of enemies with D as a burst, the next wave of enemies, her burst is already going to be over, so you're basically relying on the remaining duration of Zangoli's burst to do any damage in multi-wave. Vertical scaling is an 8. Her constellations are amazing. However, I didn't give her full points on it because she's a standard banner character, so you can't like plan to get her constellations. And also because even with her constellations, she's still not very good. So although they're very powerful, I don't think I can give her anything above an 8 for this. The shield check is a 6, mainly because pyro shields are going to destroy you. And then flexibility, accessibility is a 5. She's not very flexible. You really want to be using mono pyro with her. I've seen people try to do things like vaporize with Mona or reverse melt, but it looks it's not good. Just don't do that. So overall, that gives her a 29, which puts her into D tier. Next, Chichi. DPS as supporting, I gave her a 3. Her support is pretty terrible. I mean, she heals, which is nice, but like, there's not any team that would actually want to use her as a healer, unless she's also being used as a driver for that team. And as a driver, she can do okay DPS with Xingqiu Clan, but it's not very good. Single target is a 3. AoE, I gave her a 5 because Xingqiu Clan can actually be pretty solid in AoE. And also, she's one of her main driver teams is using her to drive Baizu, and Baizu is really good in AoE, but the team's still not going to be very good because it's a Chichi team, so I didn't give her anything above a 5. Multi-Wave is a 6. Can't really think of anything particularly holding her back in Multi-Wave, but also nothing particularly making her excel in it either, so I think a 6 makes sense. Vertical scaling is a 1. Her constellations are just terrible. Shield check is a 5. I can't really see any reason why she would be particularly good with dealing with shields, or particularly horrible at it. Then accessibility, flexibility, I gave her a 10. She's pretty simple to use. You kind of just use her on field and normal attacking to drive teams. So overall, she gets a 33, which puts her into C tier. Mona, DPS are supporting, I gave her a 7. Though her supporting can be very powerful, the duration is so short, it's really hard to make good use out of. Single target is a 7, AoE a 7, multi-wave a 4 because she marks enemies, so in multi-wave, if you finish off a wave of marked enemies by her, the next wave isn't going to be marked and you don't get any buffing out of her, other than, I guess, Thrilling Tales. Vertical scaling is a 4, her constellations other than C4 are pretty terrible. Shield check, I gave a 4 because she's mainly going to be used in freeze teams, and again, those just get completely destroyed by things like cryo shields. Then accessibility, flexibility is a 5. She really doesn't have many team options. I really can't think of anything you actually use her in other than freeze these days, so overall she gets a 38. So that is C tier. Next, Jean. DPS as supporting is a 6, single target is 6, AoE an 8, multi-wave is a 4. Main reason for multi-wave is because things like Sunfire are reliant on enemies being inside her burst, but if they leave her burst, she basically loses all of her value. Vertical scaling is a 7 because with her C2 and C4, she becomes a really good support for Zhao and Wanderer. She can also use Freedom Sworn, so I think that makes her deserving of a 7 for vertical scaling. Shield check is an 8 because Sunfire can be very, very good at dealing with shields. However, if the enemies don't stay inside her circle, you lose that value, so can't give her anything above an 8 for this. Then accessibility, flexibility is a 5. There's really not that many teams that actually want to use Jean, other than like Wanderer and Zhao teams, if you have her at C4, and like Sunfire teams to deal with specific shields. But yeah, overall she gets a B. So 44 puts her, I believe, right below Eula. Let me double check. Yeah, Eula was a 49, so Jean is going to be right behind her. Next is Tanari. So DPS is a 10, single target is a 10, AoE is a 4. He basically has no AoE. However, he's used for teammates like Kasawa and Yai that can make up for his own lack of AoE, so he gets bonus points there. In fact, actually, I think a 4 is too low. I'm gonna bump that up to a 6 because Kasawa and Yai really help fix his AoE. Multi-wave is a 9. Nothing in particular holding him back here. Vertical scaling is a 9. His constellations are very good, and you also have access to things like Yai and Kasawa constellations. Actually, I think he should have a 10 in vertical scaling. I'm going to change that to a 10. He has so many ways you can vertically invest to make him stronger. Shield check is a 6 because he's dangerous, so cryo shields. And accessibility, flexibility, I gave him a 6. Overall, he gets a 57 with those adjustments, so that's going to put him into A tier, right behind Sino. Next, Ching. So, TPS are supporting, I gave her a 7. Single target is a 7. AoE, I don't have AoE as a 7. That should be at least an 8. She has really good AoE. Multi-Wave, I have an 8. Our teams are quick swap, so even if you're using Nahida, you can deal with Multi-Wave pretty well. Although she doesn't really need Nahida, you can use like Baizu instead. Vertical scaling, I gave a 7 because her own constellations aren't very good, but you do have access to things like Kazuha and Nahida constellations. Shield check is a 7 because, again, cryo shields. She does apply Electro pretty fast, so she can deal with them, but just not quite to the degree that Sino can, so I think 7 makes sense. Then accessibility, flexibility, I think a 10 makes sense. So overall, she gets a 54, putting her into A tier. What scar? I'm trying to remember what Childe's scar was. Childe was also a 54, and I'm obviously not going to put the Ching above Childe, so yeah, this makes sense. Next, I have Dendro Traveler. Oh, where'd they go? Give me 1 second. Alright, there we go. So Dendro Traveler, DPS are supporting, I gave a 7. Single target is 7. AoE, I gave an 8 because their AoE is really good with Hydro infused burst, but not all of their teams have access to Hydro, so Multi-Wave is an 8 just because enemies can spawn outside of the range of their burst. This isn't that likely to happen if you use Hydro, but again, not all of their teams are using Hydro. Vertical scaling is a 5 because it's Dendro Traveler. Everybody has C6. There's not much you can do beyond that, which everybody already has. But also, if you're using Dendro Traveler, you're more than likely using them as an alternative to Nahida, so I'm not going to give them much bonus points for being able to use Nahida constellations. Shield check is a 6 because, as I've already said, cryo shields, Dendro, they don't go well together. And then accessibility, flexibility is going to be an 8. They're Dendro, so they're really flexible, and yeah, they're Travelers, so everybody has them. So overall, a 49, putting them in B tier. Next up is Venti. DPS are supporting is 10. His DPS is really good, and his supporting is amazing. Single target is a 7. You might be surprised that it's not lower than this. That's because even in single target, if you're using him with like Wanderer and have him buffed by Farazan and Bennett, which I believe is his best team in the current meta, his DPS in single target is still really good, so the hitbox of his burst is really big, so he's likely still hitting the enemy even in single target. Then AoE is a 10, Multi-Wave is a 10, Vertical Scaling is 6 just because his own constellations aren't that good, but you can at least slap Elegy or like Polar Star and something on him to improve him vertically. Shield check is a 6, and accessibility, flexibility is a 4, mainly because there's not actually that many teams that he works super well with, since a lot of characters can't hit enemies inside his burst, and also because he's not that good in specific types of content if he's not able to group. Although that's not an issue if you're using him with Wanderer, which is his best team, because his DPS is still really good, even if his grouping isn't being super valuable. Although at that point, you would be better off using somebody other than him anyway. But yeah, I think 4 makes sense. So overall, he gets a 53, putting him into A tier. I'm going to put him right behind the Luke. Now, Albedo, I give him an 8 for DPS as supporting. His DPS is pretty solid, and he's also the only off-field Geo battery in the game, making him pretty essential. Unless you count Zangoli, but yeah, it makes him pretty essential for Ito. Single target, I gave an 8. Main thing holding his points back here is that single target is usually a boss, and bosses can break his skill, making him lose all his value. AoE, I gave a 7. His skill does have AoE, but it's not great AoE. Multi-wave, I gave a 7, just because enemies might spawn outside of his skill. Vertical scaling is a 3, his constellations are terrible. Shield check is a 4, he doesn't work on shields at all. Accessibility, flexibility is a 3, because he pretty much only has one good team in the meta right now, so overall he gets a C. Top of C tier. Now we have Coco. DPS as supporting is a 9. She's pretty good at supporting the team she's used in. Single target is a 7, just because the team she's used in, like Nilo and Ayaka, are mainly AoE teams. AoE is an 8. Multi-wave is a 7, mainly points deducted here because enemies might just spawn away from her jellyfish. Vertical scaling is a 5. I don't think her constellations are good and her weapon is terrible. Shield check is a 4 because the team she's used in have shields that they really struggle with. Then accessibility, flexibility is a 6. So overall, she gets a 46, which puts her into B tier. Where is she? It is so hard to find these characters. There she is. Next, Ganyu. DPS are supporting, I give her a 7. But DPS these days really isn't that great compared to a lot of the other 5-star units, but it is still pretty good, so a 7 makes sense. Single target is a 5, but AoE is a 9 because she has really good AoE. Multi-wave, I gave her a 10 because of her range is so good, you don't really have to leave Bennett's circle at all with her. Then vertical scaling, I gave a 6. Constellations are good. I don't think they're that good, but they're alright. Shield check is a 10. The teams are pretty good at dealing with basically every shield type. Accessibility, flexibility, I gave a 6. So overall, she got a 53, putting her in A tier. I think right behind Venti makes sense. And I believe all we have left is Aloy. She was a pretty hard one to rank because, like, nobody uses her, but DPS not supporting, I gave a 3. She can be pretty useful, pretty nice as a cryo battery, I guess. Single target a 3, AoE a 5, multi-wave a 5, vertical scaling a 4. There's nothing you can do to vertically scale into her, but like the only teams you use her in have decent vertical scaling, I guess. Shield check a 4, accessibility, flexibility a 4, so overall I gave her a 28. I didn't put much thought into Aloy's scar, to be honest, so don't think too much of it, but yeah, it puts her into D tier. If I can find her. There she is. But yeah, that should be everybody. Let me double check. Yeah, that's everybody except for the other travelers, so Geo, Anemo, and Electro, but I didn't bother doing the categories for them because I mean they're just not good. Nobody uses them. I really didn't want to take the time to do that, but just know that if I did do them, they'd probably end up about right here. So yeah, this is the list overall. S tier is Nahida, Kasawa, Yaylon, Baizu, Ridein, Haytham. A tier is Wanderer, Yai, Sino, Tanari, Zangoli, Nilo, Ito, Childe, Kaching, Diluc, Venti, Ganyu, Ayato, Zhao. B tier is Ayaka, Klee, Hutao, Shanha, Yoimiya, Eula, Dendro Traveler, Kokomi, Jean. C tier is Albedo, Mona, Chichi, and D tier is Dia, Geo, Anemo, and Electro Traveler, and Aloy. So yeah, that's the list. Let me know in the comments below what you think of it, and if you have any questions regarding any points that I didn't necessarily elaborate on that you want to know more about, just ask in the comments, and I'll gladly conversate with you about it. And yeah, just keep in mind with this list, just because like I said earlier, just because a character places higher than another doesn't mean they're generally going to be better than a unit placed below them. So just let's say just because the Luke is in A tier but the Hu Tao is in B tier doesn't necessarily mean he's generally going to be better than Hu Tao. Although personally I think he is, but that's besides the point. But also something like Zhao being below Ganyu, I mean, personally I think Zhao is leagues better than Ganyu, but with the way I did this, Ganyu just happens to end up better because of some other categories that Zhao was lacking in. But generally, I obviously think Zhao is a way better unit than Ganyu. So yeah, just keep things like that in mind when looking at this tier list. But yeah, I think that's all for today. Thanks, bye, and please like and subscribe.